Here is the full script in plain text. What happened when Britain buried 10,000 invisible bombs across Nazi-occupied France? A documentary script written for AI narration with British accent. Spring 1944. The French countryside south of the Loire Valley lies quiet beneath an overcast sky. A lone figure moves through the undergrowth, boots sinking into the soft earth, breathing shallow and controlled. He carries nothing that would betray him to a passing German patrol: no weapons, no radio, no maps. What he carries instead is a small canvas satchel, and inside it, something so innocuous in appearance that it could be mistaken for a fistful of old bolts or a handful of scrap metal pulled from a broken fence. He reaches a culvert at the edge of a secondary road and crouches. Working quickly and without a torch, he presses each object into the muddy bank, covering them with a thin layer of soil and dead leaves. Within 4 minutes, he is gone. The road looks exactly as it did before. But something has changed. Something is waiting. What that resistance operative buried in the darkness was not improvised or crude. It was a precision instrument, a pressure-fused explosive device, roughly the size of a man's boot, encased in a non-metallic shell that rendered it entirely invisible to the magnetic mine detectors the Germans were already beginning to sweep along known sabotage routes. It was one of tens of thousands. And it had been designed, manufactured, and dispatched from a country 300 kilometers away, across the English Channel, by an organization that officially did not exist. The story of Britain's covert landmine program in occupied Europe is not one that appears in many history books. It lacks the grandeur of the Dambusters raid or the celebrity of the Enigma machine. But in terms of tactical ingenuity, logistical ambition, and sheer disruptive effect, few wartime innovations come closer to reshaping the nature of irregular warfare. This is the story of how Britain designed, produced, and buried 10,000 invisible bombs across Nazi-occupied France, and why the Germans never quite worked out how to stop them. To understand why the program existed at all, it is necessary to understand the catastrophic situation Britain faced in the summer of 1940. France had fallen in 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force had been evacuated from Dunkirk, abandoning enormous quantities of equipment. The prospect of a German invasion of Britain itself was considered, by many in Whitehall, to be a matter of when rather than if. Churchill's government faced a brutal strategic reality: the Wehrmacht was dug into Western Europe, supply lines stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Eastern Front were beginning to stiffen, and Britain had almost no conventional means of striking back. The answer, in Churchill's view, was sabotage on an industrial scale. In July 1940, the Special Operations Executive, the SOE, was formally established with a mandate that its first director, Hugh Dalton, described as being asked to set Europe ablaze. The ambition was breathtaking. The practicalities were considerably more complicated. Resistance networks across France were fractured, under-equipped, and under constant threat from the Gestapo and the milice. Agents parachuted into the field routinely found themselves operating without reliable weapons or explosives. The standard British service explosive, plastic explosive, or PE, was effective but bulky, required specialist handling, and left forensic traces that the Germans had learned to identify and catalogue. More critically, the Wehrmacht and the organization tote the engineering corps responsible for maintaining German-occupied infrastructure had developed systematic protocols for protecting roads, rail lines, and supply routes. By 1942, magnetic mine detectors were being swept along key roads before convoys passed. German engineers had also become adept at identifying disturbed earth, noting even slight variations in soil density along route margins. Standard buried charges were being found and neutralized faster than they could be planted. The SOE needed a device that was light enough for a courier to carry, simple enough for an untrained civilian to deploy, and invisible enough to defeat the detection systems the Germans were rolling out across the occupied zone. It needed, in short, a completely new kind of weapon. The solution emerged from Station 9, a converted country house near Welwyn Garden City in Hertfordshire that served as one of the SOE's primary research and development facilities. It was known, with characteristic British understatement, simply as the Frythe. The scientists and engineers working there, many of them drawn from civilian backgrounds in chemistry, mechanical engineering, and industrial design, were tasked with producing weapons that were, above all else, practically deployable by ordinary people under extraordinary pressure. The device they developed was designated the Mark II anti-personnel and anti-vehicle pressure switch, though it was more commonly known within SOE circles as the clam and its associated pressure-fused variant as the switch number 10. What made it revolutionary was the material from which it was constructed. Where conventional mines and explosive charges used metal casings, ferrous or non-ferrous, the clam series used a phenolic resin composite, a form of early industrial plastic that produced no magnetic signature whatsoever. Pressed into the earth beneath a road surface, it was as electromagnetically silent as a lump of clay. The device itself was roughly 22 centimeters in length, 9 centimeters in width, and weighed approximately 900 grams, about the same as 2 tins of baked beans placed end to end. It contained a central charge of Nobel 808 plastic explosive, a British formulation that was stable under normal temperature variation, would not detonate from a dropped match or a rifle shot, but responded predictably to the percussion of a detonator. The pressure fused the switch No. 10 was a small brass plunger mechanism enclosed entirely within a secondary phenolic casing. When a weight exceeding roughly 90 kilograms was applied, equivalent to the tire of a lorry, the wheel of a loaded ammunition cart, or the booted foot of a soldier who happened to step precisely in the wrong place, the plunger compressed, the firing pin struck, and detonation occurred within milliseconds. The manufacturing process was distributed across multiple sites to reduce vulnerability to German bombing. Component casings were produced at a factory in Birmingham under a commercial cover, with the phenolic parts cast in the same facilities that supplied electrical insulation components to the GPO. The explosive filling was conducted at a specialist facility in Ayrshire, Scotland, where industrial safety protocols allowed the handling of bulk Nobel 808. Final assembly and inspection took place at Welwyn itself. Records regarding total production numbers remain partially classified, but available documentation including SOE supply manifests cross-referenced with post-war French resistance accounts suggests that between 1942 and the liberation of France in 1944, somewhere in the region of 8,000 to 12,000 complete devices were dispatched to agents in the field, with the most commonly cited figure being approximately 10,000 units. They were delivered by three principal methods: dropped by Lysander or Halifax aircraft in waterproofed containers to pre-arranged reception sites, carried across the Pyrenees by courier networks operating through neutral Spain, and in smaller quantities, smuggled across the demarcation line between occupied and Vichy France, concealed within commercial vehicles. Each device was packed individually in a grease cloth wrapping that further muffled any metallic clinking and preserved the pressure mechanism against moisture ingress. A single Halifax could carry enough devices in one drop to mine an entire stretch of secondary road. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and there is a great deal more to come. The operational record of the clam and its associated devices is, by the necessary nature of clandestine warfare, fragmentary. What survives is a mixture of SOE field reports, post-war debriefs conducted by the British and French governments, and the testimony of surviving resistance members collected by historians in the 1970s and 1980s. What emerges from these sources is a picture of sustained and remarkably effective disruption across a wide arc of occupied France, particularly in the southwestern departments through which German supply convoys traveling towards the Normandy front would eventually be forced to pass. In the Dordogne and the Sarrze, networks affiliated with the Army SECRT reported using pressure devices to disable at least 40 vehicles between the autumn of 1943 and June 1944 alone, including a number of Wehrmacht fuel tankers whose loss created measurable disruption to local German logistics. In Brittany, agents operating under the network known as Scientist mined 3 separate secondary routes in advance of the D-Day landings, forcing German forces responding to the Allied invasion to divert onto longer, more exposed roads where they became vulnerable to air attack. Near Limoges, a German military police unit assigned to sweep a road for mines spent 11 days working along a 2-kilometer stretch and found nothing because the devices buried there were phenolic and their detectors were magnetic. The convoy they were protecting passed through 3 weeks later. Two vehicles did not reach their destination. German records captured after the liberation reveal a growing anxiety about what they termed Kunststoffen and plastic mines by late 1943. Counterintelligence reports circulated within the Sicherheitsdienst acknowledged that existing detection protocols were inadequate and called for the development of acoustic or ground-penetrating methods. Those methods were never successfully deployed at scale. It is worth placing the British program in context by examining what Germany and the United States were doing in the same period. The Wehrmacht's own irregular warfare doctrine was primarily offensive rather than defensive, focused on placing agents behind enemy lines rather than equipping resistance movements already in the field. German research into non-metallic mines existed, notably in the form of the Shoe Mine 42, a wooden box mine that was deployed extensively on the Eastern Front. However, the shoe mine was a defensive weapon, designed to be emplaced in large quantities by regular troops and to slow infantry advances. It was not engineered for covert single-unit deployment by untrained civilians, and it was considerably heavier, weighing roughly 2 kilograms and larger, making casual concealment far more difficult. The Americans, through their Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, the CIA's wartime predecessor, developed their own sabotage devices, including the pressure switch limpet mine intended for maritime use. American-produced devices were in several respects technically comparable to the British equivalents, but the OSS program in France was both smaller in scale and later in establishment than the SOE's network. American agents in France operated partly in collaboration with SOE structures, and American field reports from 1944 confirm the use of British-supplied devices in several key operations. The distinction, then, was not primarily technical. It was organizational. Britain had built the infrastructure, the agent networks, the supply chains, and the doctrine to deploy these devices at scale before any comparable American capability existed in the theater. Assessing the actual impact of 10,000 pressure mines buried across occupied France is an exercise that demands both honesty and proportion. The material damage, vehicles disabled, convoys delayed, roads temporarily closed, was real but not, by itself, war-winning. The strategic contribution lay elsewhere. Every mile of road that a German commander could not guarantee as safe was a mile along which he had to move with caution, with flankers deployed, with mine-sweeping teams burning time and fuel. The psychological burden on German logistics officers, who by 1944 faced not only Allied air attack and partisan ambush but the invisible threat of buried devices on roads that looked entirely normal, was cumulative and corrosive. Fear changes behavior. Changed behavior slows tempo. Slowed tempo has consequences. The legacy of the program extended well beyond 1944. The principle of the non-metallic pressure mine, a weapon invisible to magnetic detection and deployable by a non-specialist, became a defining problem of post-war mine clearance doctrine, one that would haunt conflicts from Korea through to the Falklands and beyond. The SOE's phenolic composite approach is a direct conceptual ancestor of the plastic anti-personnel mines that created so much suffering in conflicts throughout the latter half of the 20th century and which the Ottawa Treaty of 1997 sought to eliminate. The engineers at Station 9 were solving a specific problem in a specific war. They could not have foreseen where the principle would travel. Several examples of original SOE pressure devices survive in museum collections. The Imperial War Museum in London holds a small number in its reserve collection, though they are rarely displayed. The Musée de l'Assistance in Limoges holds what is believed to be a genuine field example recovered from the SORRZE, still in its original grease cloth wrapping. Return, for a moment, to that culvert on the edge of a French road. The operative is long gone. The countryside is quiet. A German supply convoy will pass this way in 3 weeks' time, headlights off, moving slowly through a moonless night towards the Normandy coast where, though the driver cannot yet know it, an Allied army is preparing to land. The driver of the leading lorry does not know that the road ahead of him was swept for mines 4 days ago and cleared. He does not know that it has been walked by a man he will never meet, carrying a canvas satchel, working by feel in the dark. He does not know, and he will never know. That was precisely the point. The clam and its variants were not the weapons that won the war in France. The war in France was won by armies and air power and extraordinary human courage. But wars are not won only on their largest canvases. They are won also in the small, unglamorous, invisible moments, a figure crouching in the mud, pressing something cold and firm into the bank of a ditch, covering it with leaves, and walking away. They are won by things that wait, unseen, until the weight of an empire's logistics bears down on exactly the right square centimeter of earth. Britain buried 10,000 invisible bombs across Nazi-occupied France. The Germans swept the roads. The convoys rolled through. Some of them did not arrive. That is what patience, ingenuity, and a non-metallic casing can do to a war.